I think we are ready to go, Birte.
Okay, so yes, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this event in commemoration of the 85th anniversary of the so-called Polenaktion. It's great you're all here. I'm really glad that so many of you came to attend this event. My name is Birte Klarzig. Some of you know me. I work as a researcher for Jewish history at the Documentation Center on National Socialism. And we organized this event tonight in cooperation with the Lern- and Gedenkort Javne, the memorial site for the former Jewish grammar school in Cologne. And it's also, it also marks the start of a new series the Documentation Center would like to establish as the so-called Family Talks, which will be a quarterly panel discussion with relatives and descendants of former Jewish citizens of Cologne. And this is the first event in that series as well. And I'm really glad that so many people are here and to commemorate the people who were deported in the so-called Polenaktion. Well, you all know it's troubling times at the moment, and I think under the current circumstances, it's difficult to talk about the past without considering the present situation. So before we start, I would just like to say how shocked we were by these barbaric, brutal terror attacks by the Hamas regime on Israel. And we really feel deeply for everyone who's affected directly or indirectly by that situation. And it's really an unbearable thought that Jewish people, not just in Israel, but also in other countries, are once more threatened by anti-Semitic attacks, violence. And yes, we will do everything we can to support you and help everyone affected by the situation. And I think it's ever more important to also deal with the past, to remind people how important it really is to combat anti-Semitism, to stand up against any anti-Semitic attacks or notions in the public. And so I'm really glad to have three discussants on the panel tonight from various countries, really. So we've got Larry Rebacz, who I think grew up in America, in the US, but now lives in Israel, and he's joining us from Israel tonight. And we've got Connie Marco, who is a docent at the Holocaust Museum in Los Angeles, among other things. And Michael Newman from the UK, who's chief executive of the AJR, the Association of Jewish Refugees in the UK. And I'm so happy to have you all here on the panel. And your families all have in common that they came from regions which became Polish territory after World War I. And they had emigrated to Cologne in the 1910s. And they were part of quite a huge influx of people from East Europe, from parts which are now belong to Poland and Ukraine and Galicia, who fled from the pogroms and the attacks in East Europe against the Jewish population there in the 1910s and 20s, and who sought refuge in Germany. And there were a couple of thousands living in Cologne, people who had come here, from between the turn of the century until the late 20s. And many of them, one has to say, did quite well here. So given that they had to leave everything behind, that they came here with hardly anything, many of them managed to establish small businesses, run shops here, really made a living in Cologne and felt quite integrated in the city. And they were able to grant their children higher education, which was not that common in the working class or lower middle class families in those times in Germany. So I think many of them did quite well, just as your families did. But in March 1938, the Polish government announced a change of law which stripped all Polish citizens who had not lived in Poland for more than 5 years of their Polish nationality. And that mostly affected those Jewish immigrants from Poland who had fled in the 1910s and 20s. And in the fear of having tens of thousands of stateless Jewish people living in Germany, the Nazi government in Germany in October 1938, at the end of October 1938, on the 25th and the 26th of October, expelled around about 25,000 Jewish Polish citizens from Germany, sent them to the Polish border in the so-called Polenaktion. And since Poland refused them entry, they were stuck on the border and had to live in camps, very makeshift camps, which were erected on the border. One of them being the one in Zbaszyn or Benchen, which was the one where people from Cologne were sent to. And well, your relatives, Connie, Larry, and Michael, they were among those who were sent there. In Cologne, it was mostly men, around about 600 men who were well, sent from Cologne to the Polish border in what a colleague coined as the deportation before the deportations. And we are going to talk about that, how it affected your families, how it affected your family history. There are a few technical things I'd like to say before we start with the presentations. As you noticed when you entered the room, we are recording this event, and we would like to publish it in one way or another, either putting it online or sending it out to people who could not make it tonight and asked for a recording of this event. So if you do not want to appear with your picture or with your full name, please turn off your camera or yeah, just change your name if you don't want to be if you don't want to be recorded. So, and we will start with the presentations. Each of our discussants will give around about 10-minute presentation on their family history, and afterwards we will discuss topics around the family history, their research into the family history. Please feel free to put questions into the chat. We'll get back to them later, and then we will open the panel for questions from the audience for the last 10 minutes or so. And then you can either put them in the chat or post them in the last 10 minutes. Okay, I think that's all from me for the start. So I would like to hand over to Larry Rebacz, who is going to present, give a short presentation first.
Thank you. Most of the following information is from a journal my mother wrote over a period of 3 years after my father died in 1991. My father, Philip Rebacz, was born in Ulanów, Poland in 1909. When he was 7 or 8 years old, his family moved to Cologne. So his father, Abraham Rebacz, would not be drafted into the Polish army, and because the economy was better in Germany. My mother, Rose Adderman, was born in Cologne in 1914, but her parents were also from Poland. My parents spent much of their childhood in sports clubs and had many friends. I've been told my father was a very good soccer player and enjoyed playing as often as possible. My parents dated for a long time and had a long engagement. On Saturday nights, they often went with a large group of friends dancing and to concerts. After the Nazis became more powerful, Jews could no longer go to Gentile places. They started their own venues for these activities, such as theaters and boxing matches. My father and his father sold housewares and dry goods in installment sales, going door to door in and around Cologne. My mother's family had a tire recapping business. This is a picture of my father and his father. And this is another picture of my father. They lived in a neighborhood with many Jews who were originally from Poland. My parents married on September 2nd, 1938. On October 27th, 8 weeks after their wedding, my father was deported to Zbaszyn. My father, my two grandfathers, and my uncle were ordered to go to the Cologne train station. My mother's father knew someone who had connections and could bring people back from the train station. This person was able to bring back my mother's father and my uncle, but my father and his father had already left on the train. The deportees could only take a few belongings with them. Even sick people were put on the train on stretchers and in wheelchairs. Thousands of people arrived in Zbaszyn on the border between Germany and Poland, but Poland did not let them enter the country. They were stuck at the Zbaszyn train station without food or water. The conditions in the train station were horrible. There were no beds, so the refugees had to buy straw and make mats on which to sleep. During the first few days, local Poles came and sold water and food at very high prices. A few days later, local Polish Jews who had heard about the refugees and their terrible conditions came with food and water. These local Jews organized a committee to help the refugees. The committee did what they could to help those stuck at the train station. My father and the other young men were strong enough to survive, but many of the old and sick were not. German Jews who had relatives in Poland were allowed to leave the station to go live with their relatives. My father did not want to leave Zbaszyn because he was waiting for his visa to go to the United States. People who had visas to emigrate to other countries were allowed to leave. The committee sent mail written by the refugees to Germany, and families in Germany could send mail to Zbaszyn. Through the committee, refugees who had businesses in Germany were allowed to return to liquidate whatever they could and close their businesses. I do not know what my father and grandfather did every day for 6 months, but it must have been difficult to be away from their families and spend every day doing nothing with little or no money to spend on necessities. Finally, after 6 months of extreme hardship, my father received a letter to come to the U.S. consulate in Stuttgart to pick up his visa. He was very worried because he had to be there on a specific date. The committee arranged that my father could go back to Cologne to liquidate his business and at the same time go to the U.S. consulate to pick up his visa. There was no guarantee that the Poles would let you out of Poland and that the Germans would let you back into Germany. My grandfather and father must have felt terrible when my father left because they both knew that they would never see each other again. My mother had to meet my father at the U.S. consulate to pick up her visa. My father arrived in Stuttgart unshaven and wearing a coat that my mother believed he had worn for the entire 6 months, day and night. When it was my parents' turn to receive their visas, the quota had been filled for the month. They were told they would have to wait until the next month. The embassy said the visas would be mailed. My father was only allowed to stay in Germany for a few days before he would have to return to Poland. My parents were sure he would not be able to leave Poland again. They took the train to Cologne on the same day they left the embassy. When my parents returned to Cologne, more and more people had left or had disappeared. Each day it appeared to be emptier. My father's mother and my mother's parents prepared to leave for Poland. My father's youngest sister, Gusti, prepared to go to Israel with a youth Aliyah children's group. Another sister, Molly, waited until her mother and grandmother left for Poland and was lucky to make it to England the day before the war started. After a few days, my parents received their visas and hurried to leave for the United States. People offered thousands of dollars to buy these visas. The day my parents left for America, leaving his mother and her parents at the train station with the Nazis was indescribable. After several dangerous encounters with Nazi officials, my parents left Germany for Belgium and then took a ship from Marseille, France to the US in May 1939. This is a picture of my parents living in Florida after they retired. My father's parents were eventually told to return to Ulanov, and my mother's parents were sent back to Krakow. They were all murdered in Belzec and Auschwitz. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I think your this is a very rare insight into the conditions in the camp and the insights into what happened to the people who lived there and what circumstances they lived there. And you said you've got this information from a journal.
My mother decided to, it's almost a biography. She decided to write it after my father died, and she worked on it for 3 years.
Okay, so do you know where she got the information from? Is it did your father tell her?
From my father telling her, or correspondence with my father.
Is it published? I mean, is it, or is it just for?
No, it's actually handwritten. I've thought about having it typed up. It's hard to read her writing, but I haven't gotten around to it yet.
I think, yeah, it's, as I said, it's quite a rare insight we have, because many people did not have the chance. They didn't survive, and they wouldn't be able to put down their memories. And okay, so thank you. So I suggest we go on with Connie Marco's presentation.
Hello, my name is Connie Marco, and you know, the impact of being a child of 2 Holocaust survivors has been astronomically intense. Every aspect of my life revolves around this experience of both my mother and my father, and everything I do in my world, as far as my profession and as far as being a parent, involves this too. So I have 3 children, and that means that they all have grandparents that were Holocaust survivors. I married a child of Holocaust survivors as well. So his parents are survivors. So our children also have that experience of only being around children of Holocaust survivors, and not having much family either, not having aunts, uncles, and cousins, because they were all murdered. So let me start my presentation. So my father was born in Cologne in 1921. And he had a sister who was born in 1919, and they were just 2 children. Their parents came from Galicia. So at the time that they grew up, the grandparents, it was probably Russia, and there were pogroms, and life for the Jews living in the Palace settlements was very bad. So ironically, they left there to go to Cologne because they had heard from other people who had immigrated that it was a much better place for Jews, that the opportunities were much better, and it was a safer place to have a family. So they immigrated there, and, you know, probably in the 1910s or whatnot. And they actually met each other in Cologne. My understanding is that there was a matchmaker that introduced the 2 of them to one another, but they were both from areas in what is Galicia. My grandfather was from Cologne, and my grandmother was from Winnicke near Limburg. And they lived in this area in Cologne on Thibault-Gasse Street, which I had the privilege of going to, and having an Israeli German tour guide there that walked me through the neighborhood and explained to me what life was like when my father was a child. And the whole neighborhood was a very Jewish area, and most of the inhabitants of that neighborhood were people who had immigrated from the same place. And as a matter of fact, there was a book written that the tour guide had shown me of people who lived in that neighborhood, and the stories of the people who lived in adjoining apartments in the neighborhood were identical to that of my grandparents who immigrated from the same place. And I have no doubt that Larry and Michael's family knew my grandparents and my parents, their descendants. So it was a very small community. And having met Berthe was amazing because I had the opportunity to lay stumbling stones in front of their apartment house in honor of my aunt, my father, and my grandparents. And meeting Berthe was amazing because she showed me documentation of them having lived there. And the documentation center of Cologne, where Berthe works and has a museum, and was actually a Nazi headquarters during World War II, and it had a prison in it. And it was the actual place where my grandfather went to when he was deported from Cologne in 1938 in October, and was deported to Belgium or Zbaszyn. Those are the names that my father used to refer to the area where they were sent. And the town was a town for about 6,000 people lived in it, and then about 12,000 more people came from Cologne during this action. And my father survived because he wasn't there when this occurred. He was in a nearby city in Germany visiting relatives. And my father had been part of a Jewish youth Zionist organization that was teaching young people how to become farmers and immigrate to Israel and to be chalutzim, to be pioneers. And so he was already part of that. And he came back to Cologne, and the way my father described it, he said that he came back and to this area which was extremely, all Jewish people. And he said it was like a ghost town. Nobody was there. The streets were empty. Nobody was there. He didn't know what was going on. And then he says, this is his story. He said, somebody pulled him. And they said, what are you doing here? You're not supposed to be here. They took everybody already. And he says that this was part of that youth organization, Hatzbara, it was named, or I'm not quite sure, but I've done research on it, and I learned of this amazing organization that had a network all set up. I don't know how that is possible. And they gave my father false papers saying that he was an agricultural student going to Denmark to study. And they had set up this organization to bring Jewish youth to Denmark, and then to hide them in people's in righteous, gentle homes and farms, and hide them. And so my father said he went on this train, and he said that he was so nervous. He was like sweating bullets on this train. He had these false documents, and his last name is Kalt, so that's a German name. And it didn't say he was a Jew, of course. And then he said they would kept checking his papers, and he was born in Germany, so he spoke fluent German, of course, and he looked like an Aryan because he had blonde hair and he had blue eyes and very, very white skin. So every time someone came and looked at him and looked at his papers, he passed the test. And then he arrived in Denmark, and he was hidden on a farm in Musgard, Denmark, a little island of many of their islands. And he lived with a family, a farmer named Andres Andersen. And he lived there for 5 years as a field hand. And so from the age of 17, and then in 1943, this man came, and my father said that he never knew if the farmer knew he was a Jew. It's 100% that the farmer knew he was a Jew and he was hiding him, but they never discussed it with each other. And he said that one day the farmer came up to him and said, "Sam, you trust me?" He said, "Of course," because Sam had been without parents and living there for all this time, from 1938 to 1943. And he said, take my bicycle and go to Copenhagen, and your people will be there and they will take care of you. And so, you know, what I've come to learn is that when Andres Anderson went to church, the clergy there told him that there was going to be a rescue to get all the Jews out of Denmark to Sweden by the fishermen, and to tell any Jews that you know of that are in hiding to go to the docks. And so he came and told my father this. And my father said that he went to the docks, and he saw a bunch of Orthodox Jews wearing black garb going on these boats. And he never had seen, he knew they were Jews, but he had never seen that. He had been in hiding for so long that he was, you know, perplexed as to what was happening. And one of the people on the docks said, do you want to go? And they threw him on the boat, and off he went. He lived in Sweden for another 5 years, because it was 1943, and then to get money and to come back. And then he went back to Andres Anderson's farm because his whole family had been killed. And Andres said to him, Sam, you can't stay here forever. You're a young man. You have to go to your people. And he immigrated to Israel. But you know, having been in Sweden, he said at first they didn't know who these people were that were coming, so they kind of put them into a camp with barbed wire and wouldn't let them go out, and it was really awful circumstances. But then they realized who they were, and he said that actually the Swedish people put them in nice hotels and were good to them and gave them good food, so things changed while they were there. But ironically, so then my father went to Israel, and my mother, who was a survivor from Hungary, who had been in Auschwitz, had also immigrated to Israel, and they met each other in Tel Aviv, and they got married in Tel Aviv. And then my father had a relative who had left Cologne much earlier and immigrated to the United States. And actually my only relative that I have, Marilyn Azar, is on the line. Her grandfather and grandmother sponsored my parents to come from Israel to America and to live in the Fairfax neighborhood of Los Angeles. And so that's how my father and mother came to America. And here I have, this is a picture of my dad on the farm. So he's about 19 here. He left Cologne when he was about 17. And that's the farm in the back. And here's my dad in Israel when he was living in Israel. And then that's my mom and dad. And this is what in Los Angeles when my father and mother owned a little coffee shop. And then this is my mom and my dad in Los Angeles. And that's my sister, Michelle, one of my two other siblings. So that's my story.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think if I remember correctly, in your case, it was not just the father being deported, but also the wife and your father's sister.
Yeah, so my understanding, you just mentioned that it was mostly the men, but my understanding was that all three of them went to Zbaszyn, and that my grandfather died there. He died there. The conditions were so bad, and he got sick, and he died there. And then when the Warsaw Ghetto opened up years later, my grandmother and my aunt went to the Warsaw Ghetto. And I know this for a fact because my father received a postcard in Denmark from them that was from the Warsaw Ghetto with the Nazi eagle stamp on it. And it was addressed to my dad. And in it, she talks about the conditions in the ghetto. So then my understanding is that they were either they died in the ghetto or they were taken to Treblinka, which and murdered in Treblinka, my aunt and my grandmother.
Right, thanks a lot. So I suggest we continue with the last presentation. So Michael, it's your turn at last.
Okay, if I share this screen, I don't know if you can all see this.
Yes, we can see it.
You can see it. Okay. Okay, so thank you very much, Beata, and congratulations, Larry and Connie, on your presentations. Interesting to hear about your family background. My family story about the connection with the Polenaktion relates to my grandmother's brother, my great uncle, who was named Max or Mendel. And as I'll explain, the family had two surnames. He was born Max Jungleib and later became Max Geppert or Mendel Geppert. And this is a picture, we think, of Max. We're not actually sure because my grandmother was so deeply affected by her experiences that she didn't talk about what happened to her and her family. And so we're going on what looks like a family resemblance between Max and this gentleman, who we know was my great-grandfather. So that's certainly my grandmother's father on the right. And I asked a professor of facial recognition at a university in the UK whether these two people were related or could be related. And as you can see there, there's a high probability that they are. So we think this is Max. What we do have, though, is Max's birth certificate. And listening to Connie earlier talk about family living in the Theobaldgasse, well, this is where Max was actually born in March 1917. A very elegant-looking document. And the family lived in various places in and around this area, not far from the Theobaldstrasse. And yeah, this is where the family were from. You can see over here towards the middle on the right, the family name Tiger. This was my great-grandmother's maiden name. And I mentioned before about the connection with the Polenaktion. This document was actually something called a Lebenslauf, which was a document my grandmother prepared after the war. She came to Britain on a domestic visa. She was one of the very lucky ones to escape in her mid-20s. And in fact, she arrived on the 31st of August, 1939. And she spoke about being on the proverbial last boat from Germany. And it obviously was, because war broke out just 3 days later. So 1st of September, Germany invades Poland, Britain declares war 3rd of September. So she was very lucky to get to Britain. And here you can see she refers to her brother. I don't know how good people's German is, but here it says, my brother, Max Geppert, Jungleib, was born March 17 and was deported as part of the Polenaktion in October 1938. And underneath that sentence is this paragraph here, which explains the change of name, because the family name was not recognized, I think because his parents, Max's parents, were not married civilly, and so they had to revert to their mother's maiden name, which was Geppert, and so hence the forcible change of name by the Nazis. So I think Beate mentioned earlier about the Jews from Cologne being deported to Zbaszyn, and here you can see a list of those who were deported, including in the middle here, in this very kind of obscure handwriting, but it says Geppert. I think it's actually listed as Moses, which was another name, but he was known as Max or Mendel. And you can just about read in the third column, Köln. So this is Max from Cologne. What we do have is a series of letters that my great-grandmother was writing. For some reason that we can't quite understand, only Max was deported as part of the Polenaktion. His father, Meyer, was not. In fact, he continued to live in Cologne for another year until he was arrested in September 1939. And then he was taken to Buchenwald. And from September 39, my great-grandmother was writing to her brother in the US, to her daughter, my grandmother, who was now in the UK, and to intermediaries asking for information about the family and relaying information that she received. So this is one such letter that was written in September 1939. And if I could just show you there, and if I have my German Abitur is still in my head, that she hasn't heard anything more from, it says Mendel, which was again his sort of formal Yiddish name. She hasn't heard from him. And these letters continue. And here's another one from September 1940, where again it confirms that her husband, my great-grandfather, is in the general government, which was the area the Germans conquested. But actually he was in Buchenwald still at this time. And then again, she says, also nicht wo Mendel sind. So she's again wondering where he is. There was some talk of him going on to Warsaw, you can see there, but it's unclear. I think, from judging by the early presentations, people who had family connections in Poland were allowed to go to them, but we've never been able to identify what happened, whether there was actually family there. And then another letter, again, a few months later, she says it's 9 months since she's had any word of him. She says that she thought he was in Lemberg, which is Lviv, which is the town nearest to where the family were from. Again, mentioned earlier, I think by Connie, that the Jews in that part of Cologne had originally come from the border town, which is the border which is today between Poland and Ukraine. My grandmother and her parents were born in Rawa-Ruska, which is just in Ukraine. The nearest town is Lvov, which of course the Germans went by Lemberg. But it's unclear. And I think you have to bear in mind that a lot of the information in these letters was written in a kind of coded way, because to get through the censors. And then again, it continues. She hasn't heard anything from Mendel. Post-war, we have some information from the records of the International Tracing Service, which again just confirms his fate. And again, you can see this kind of dual name, which confused us for a long time. And then again, it says October 38, imprisoned. And again, this is from a United Restitution document that my grandmother was making for her brother, for herself, her brother, and her parents. And again, just little bits of information we've been able to pick up over the years. So on this document, on the third line of his description, it talks about him being I think a traveling salesman, if I understand correctly, in textiles. And again, you can see underneath Polish citizenship, which would have explained his deportation on the Polenaktion. And then a kind of bizarre Stark document in July 1960, where he's kind of taken as being one of those people who was murdered during the Holocaust. So I just want to come back to this picture, because when I got the invitation from Beata last week, well, before, but then the promotional information, I looked at the photograph and I was kind of immediately shocked. And I showed my daughter and I showed my family this picture, because one face immediately stood out, which is this face here. And I was wondering whether I was kind of wanting it to be him or making it fit. But to me, that face looks very similar to Max on the left, just judging by the kind of wave of his hair. So I'm interested to see whether there are other photographs of the Polish Jews taken to Cologne. Again, Connie mentioned about Stolperstein. So last year, again, with the help of Beata and Ibrahim, who I see here on the presentation, and Larissa as well, hello, we managed to put stumbling stones for my grandmother, who's the stone on the bottom left, and then you can see next to her brother Max, and his fate is unknown because we don't know what happened. But there it says Zbaszyn, which is Zbaszyn. And then the last last photograph was a project that the UK is doing to build a Holocaust memorial. And people were encouraged to design family memorial stones, which will be displayed at the memorial. So I and my son and my daughter each designed one of these stones in memory of the family. As you can see there, the family Geppert Jungleib. And that's it. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thanks so much. You showed us the birth certificate of Max, and it showed that he was born in Cologne, where the family was resident. Nevertheless, he got deported. He had the Polish nationality, which apparently had something to do with nationality being passed down from generation to generation. Can you elaborate on that? How came he was Polish citizen even though being born in Germany?
Yeah, I should also add, my daughter, who's sitting in this room over there, she helped me with the presentation, so I just wanted to say thank you to her. So as I understand it, a lot of the Polish Jews did not naturalize as German, so they retained their Polish citizenship. And so, as you say, despite being born in Germany and then living there for 21 years, and my grandmother lived there for maybe 24, 25 years. She came over when she was very young from Ruska. They were not spared the fate, and so I would understand that because he was a Polish citizen, Polish national, he was rounded up as part of the Polenaktion. The mystery actually is more around his father, why his father wasn't, and how he could somehow evade that roundup. Not that it helped him. He perished in April 41 in Buchenwald, and my great grandmother, his wife, she was murdered in Chelmno in a mobile gas van. And she was deported there from the Lodz ghetto, and she was deported to the Lodz ghetto. in October 41. I think there were 2 transports to Lodz, and she was on the first transport.
Yeah, I think the problem with the naturalization was that it was quite difficult for Polish citizens to become naturalized. So I think some of them tried and they were denied. So it wasn't that, not necessarily a voluntary decision not to become a German citizen, but rather yeah, something they just couldn't get easily.
But just to add to what you said earlier, also about the relative success of the Jews who lived in that part of Cologne. So in that Lebenslauf that I showed, she talks there about the family having being quite comfortable enough for her parents to send her and her brother to the Yavne school in Cologne, and to have home, like domestic help in their apartment. And so they were doing quite well until, of course, things changed.
Could I add something to my presentation that I forgot to do? Okay, so first of all, I wanted to mention to Michael that my grandfather also had the same profession as your family did. He was a textile salesperson, and he sold a Naya silver. He sold silverware, and he was a traveling salesman as well. So I'm sure they knew each other, honestly. So the first thing I wanted to show the Berthe, the birth certificate of my father, which I had, shared with you, which looks very much like the one you showed, Michael. So it's in this, nice writing in Cologne.
Wow.
And,
Same.
Yeah, same thing. 1921. And then I wanted to show the other pictures that I had given you, Berthe. So unfortunately, I do not have any pictures of my grandfather. Like I looked at that same picture, Michael, and was hoping I would recognize somebody that looks like my dad. But the only pictures I have is that relative in Los Angeles that sponsored my dad received these pictures. And so my dad got these when he came to America, but he had nothing when he came here. So on top is my grandmother, Rosa. And on the bottom here, the bottom picture, if you go up further, is a picture on the left of my father and his sister on the right. And it obviously looks like a professionally done photograph because he's holding these blocks. And this is him and his sister as children. And this is the only picture. These are the only pictures I have of the family in Cologne. And so I just wanted to share these with everybody.
Okay, so yeah, once again, a big thank you to all 3 of you for sharing your family histories, for giving us insights into, yes, your family and your research into their history. So I would just like to discuss some general questions with all 3 of you. And I'd like to start by asking you to tell a little bit more about how you learned about your family history. I mean, was that something which was discussed in your family, which you knew from a very young age on, or was it something which you only learned about later in your life? And how was this topic dealt with in your families?
I knew the general facts from my father growing up, but not much of the details. But I learned much more when my mother wrote this journal. Besides the Zbaszyn incident, she had talked about many more things in Germany when the Nazis came to power and things like that. It was I learned most of it from the journal.
But were you present when she wrote the journal? Did you kind of experience the process of the journal being written, or was it something you just?
We knew she was writing it, but she wouldn't let anybody see it. until she died. She left it in the drawer and told my sister, who she was living with, not to look at it until she died. And we were very surprised. We didn't even know what she was doing. And it took her 3 years. She wrote by hand, and she wasn't feeling well a lot of the time. And most of it is about missing my father, because she wrote it. She started a year after he died, and she was still missing him very much.
So why do you think she kept it such a secret? Any idea?
I don't know. I mean, there's nothing really embarrassing about it. I mean, there's many stories I didn't know, but whatever. Yeah, it was painful for her to write it, so maybe she thought it would be painful for us, but she said didn't tell my sister not to look at it until she died.
It sounds like from what my father tells me about his mother, that maybe it would have been too difficult because she just closed down conversation and unlikely to have wanted to engage in the conversation. Everything was just one-word answers, very short answers. There was no discussion about it. I think it was just too painful to deal with. I mean, in my case, it was more the contrast with my mother's family, which is very big. And so doing a family tree where everybody contributed to facts and names of cousins and distant cousins, and then the contrast to my father, who had no family. He didn't even know the names of his grandparents. So that kind of spurred me on to finding out about them, and then kind of inheriting the documents that she left and slowly going through that, piecing together the story, was how I managed to get, and then making contact with places like Beata and the Documentation Center. And I'm still going, and whenever there's one more small piece of information or anything which is new, like could that face possibly be him in that picture, is kind of an exciting development, just because there's very precious little information about him.
So, Connie, would you like to contribute as well?
So having two parents who were Holocaust survivors, and they were children, teenagers. My mom was 14 when she went to Auschwitz. And having lost all their family on both sides and not having any relatives, and being the firstborn in America, my life was strange because they wouldn't talk about anything. I didn't even know anything, like how many siblings they had. Were they rich? Were they poor? Were they observant? Were they not? I knew nothing. And everything was a big secret. And my parents were very paranoid. My daughter had a air freshener in her car, and it was a Jewish star. And my mother freaked out. She screamed and yelled at both me and my daughter and said, "Take that down. How dare you do that? You don't want to draw attention. And you should know better. She's a young girl driving around the city by herself, and you don't want her having a Jewish star hanging from her mirror." Well, guess what? If it were today, and my daughter had that on her car, I'd say the same thing that my mother said to me, because things in Los Angeles are bad. The other day, a friend said, "Are you going to take your mezuzah down?" And I said, "Why would I do that?" And she said, "Because there are pictures of ladies in burqas going around Encino and taking pictures of people's doors." I mean, I'm speechless. I mean, I'm just beyond in pain here, worrying about our hostages and worrying about the sentiment on campuses. My niece, her boyfriend was walking around campus in Virginia, and they threw him against the wall and ripped his Jewish star off his neck. you know, I'm sorry to divert to that, but my mother's paranoia and not speaking and wanting to assimilate as much as possible. You know, I never thought that I would have to be in a world where I would have to feel anywhere remotely similar to what my mother and father experienced. But so, you know, I'm a docent at the Los Angeles Museum of the Holocaust. I'm a board chair of the David Lemkowski Project, which teaches about the Holocaust. We've taught at West Point Academy. My whole life, as I mentioned before, is revolved about Holocaust education. And you know, I didn't find out about my family stories basically after my parents had died. I got involved in the museum and teaching and doing all this research. And I know now a lot of, I filled in a lot of the missing pieces. And so, and like you, Michael, I'm always grasping to learn more.
Thanks. So yeah, I think Michael already mentioned kind of what made you start the family research. That was from your mother's side, where you got the information that kind of intrigued you to find out more about your. No, sorry, it was the other way around. So what with the other two? What was kind of the initial thing which made you start researching systematically into your family history?
I haven't done much research. This journal was the source of all that I wrote about. So I still could do some now, but I've never done some before.
For me, it started when I was in high school. So I came home one day after school, and my father was watching a documentary about the Danish Jews that were rescued and brought to Sweden. And there was some old film showing the rescue and Jews being ferried across the water. And I said to my father, "Oh my gosh, Dad, did you know about this? Because I know you were in Denmark during the war." And he laughed at me and he said, "Connie, I was on that boat." And I'm like, oh my God, like that's how little I knew. So from that moment on, I just started being very interested in it. And then I went for a master's degree in marriage and family therapy, and I'm a therapist. And I did my professional paper on the secrets of the Holocaust. And I did a huge family tree, and I interviewed my family members that were survivors. And it was very interesting because they never talked about it. But now that I was this educator and I was getting an education and a degree, they all wanted to contribute, and they were all proud to be a part of being interviewed. So that was a whole new avenue that opened up. And then a friend of mine wrote a book called The Aftermath, and interviewed successful survivors, and interviewed my mother. And my mother said, "Who is this man you sent to my house? It spent 6 hours in my living room interviewing me." And he wrote in his book about her. And so, I learned a lot more, and it all started when they started sharing some of what they experienced, with me and my siblings.
Nice. So in your presentations, you already mentioned some of the archives you consulted, some of the materials you found, difficulties you encountered while doing your research. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Can you give us a bit more insights into how you started off with your research, which archives were helpful, which missing information still there. Just have you got any tips for people doing the same, probably, who are in the audience now?
Well, there's so much information that's being released on a daily basis out of Poland, and you know, if you want to look into all that stuff, and I was just in Warsaw not long ago on the March of the Living, and archives are being you know, downloaded constantly, and in Germany there's a place where they have hundreds of thousands of documents that you can look into as well. I went to Dachau, and the archivist there provided me with tons of information about my mother and my aunt, who were interned in Mildorf, a subcamp of Dachau. So, and there's so many online Jewish Gen and so many different places that you can start doing research. And being part of meeting you, Berthe, was huge in learning my father's background. And also Tal Klautzman, who I met through being there as well. She provided me with so much. But I wanted to also share that when I was preparing to come to Germany, I watched a documentary, and there was a man on the documentary talking about meeting my father as a young man. He said that a young man came to the docks on a bicycle, and we threw him on the boat. And that was my dad, because he said the boy was from Germany. He wasn't a Dane. And my father had told me that story. So it was shocking to see it on a documentary. And I shared my information with my museum, and they came to me at the beginning of the year and said that there's a book called Number the Stars, about a child's book about the Danish rescue, and they wanted to know if they could use my father's, the stuff they have in their archives about my father, to share on this teaching manual that they were doing for teachers. And they have done worksheets using those pictures I showed you of my father, and the story about the man that did the documentary and mentioned my father, and integrated that all into a teacher's manual that now is being taught in Los Angeles Unified School District. And it's just incredible that my dad's story will live on in the future.
Yeah, I can agree with those places, those archives. I mean, and also the NS-Dokumentationszentrum itself is an excellent resource, and the fact that it's also a museum where we think my great-grandfather was held initially, having been arrested, was kind of odd to see the place where he would have been imprisoned, and now its use has been transformed both as a memorial and a living documentation center. So that was very good. And Yad Vashem, my grandmother had submitted pages of testimony, so that was also quite useful, and seeing the names there of the person who submitted each page. And so you can also try to see if other people had submitted information about your own relatives. And then I think the International Tracing Service, or now known as the Arolsen Archives, is probably the world's biggest collection of documents. There's a copy in the UK, but obviously it's held in Germany as well, physically. And then I've talked in the past about the box or the suitcase that was stuffed under a bed or the back of a cupboard, which people didn't talk about, maybe a bit like Larry, your mother's journal. It was just something hidden away. And then slowly making my way through those documents to see, picking out information to find out what happened, piecing together bits of the story. It's difficult because, as you saw, some of the handwriting and the language, and if you don't speak German, then it's tricky, but slowly building up a picture of information about Max and the family. takes a long time.
You mentioned my cousin Nurit Ganati, who's on, works at Yad Vashem. She provided some of the information. And also my other cousin, Amit Landau, who's also here. I think you may have met him. He's been to Germany a few times and looked up different things for us.
Yeah, yeah, but I think that kind of resembles the experience we have in our work. It's like a jigsaw puzzle, really, and I think especially with those people who were deported to Poland, it's becoming better with the Polish archives being digitized and stuff. But I think there's still quite a few gaps missing in the documentation there. So I'd like to come to the last two questions. First, from what you were told or what you experienced in your families, what was the impact the Polenaction had on those staying behind? What did it mean for families being torn up? And does it still have an impact on your families today? Would you still say this was still a crucial part of your family history, which affects your life and your family up to the day?
Well, my father was deported 8 weeks after he got married. And those 6 months while he was away must have been very hard on my mother and both sets of parents. And my mother may have shown that both of them didn't really trust the police, even in America, because of their experiences in Germany. One time there was 2 people fighting in front of our house, and my father wouldn't call the police because he didn't want to get involved. He was afraid, because of his history with the German police, that you don't call the police, and things like that.
I wanted to say to you, Berthe, that I so appreciate you and your work and your organization. It's just so wonderful to, like Michael said, be able to go there and see exactly where my family was taken and processed, and to see that now it's a museum and an educational learning center, and that you go out into the community and educate, and that you're doing this program here to, you know, bring attention to something that many people don't even know happened. And just so grateful that, you know, that I feel that you're on our side. I mean, the tables have turned, and it's just so nice to know that Germany is supporting the Jewish nation and the Jewish people.
Thank you.
I agree. I'd like to thank Germany for the support of Israel in this difficult time, and we're praying for the safe release of the hostages and the well-being of our soldiers. We're praying for peace.
I think, I agree entirely. If for those of you who haven't seen it, I would recommend looking at the German Vice Chancellor Robert Habeck's 10-minute speech on this, I think from last week, which is outstanding. A really excellent speech on the dangers of anti-Semitism. Beate, just to answer your question, I think the impact is actually felt more by my father, who has never had a family. Antecedents. He has a wife and children, grandchildren now, but to grow up with no grandparents and a mother who was deeply traumatized, living in a foreign country with a strong German accent, was being Jewish was very difficult and affected her all her life, and it had an impact on him. So I think that's probably how it was impacted. I think the immediate impact of the Polenaction was to split a family of 4 into very separate parts. My grandmother came to England. her brother was deported on the Polenaktion, and her father was deported to Buchenwald. And then eventually her mother was deported to the Lodz ghetto. So you had this is just one example of one family of 4 being dispersed away from the family home.
Yeah, when we met earlier on, you said that you kind of, well, at least Connie and you're both working in Holocaust education in a way, or in remembrance of and support for people who with those family histories. So that's probably something which also connects you and connects you to your family story. So Connie already said that this is something many people don't even know about, the history of the Polenaktion, and it has not really been the focus of either the scientific research or remembrance culture in the past, and it's just slowly coming up on the agenda. It has come up in the past year. There's been an exhibition, a traveling exhibition, which is currently shown in London, but still, I think it's not that commonly known as other aspects of the Shoah. So have you got any wishes or any ideas what an adequate commemoration of the victims of the Polenaktion could be in the future?
Well, I mean, again, working in a little bit in Holocaust remembrance, I know it's a constantly moving situation with regards to where countries' narratives might change and attitudes. But it would be nice to think maybe that there could be, I don't know what exists in the town of Zbaszyn today. I know that years ago there was a billboard with advertising the anniversary, I think from 5 years ago or 10 years ago. But I don't know whether there's a monument or a memorial could be thought about to be built there. I don't know if one exists. I don't know. Maybe that's an initiative that could be thought about. I don't know whether, I suppose more because it's history that happened in Germany, whether this makes it into the curriculum of what people learn about in schools, for example. Obviously, it's mandatory to learn about the subject, but I don't know whether it's, again, something that could be thought about.
Berthe, a few people have asked on the chat about that book that I mentioned that Tal had showed me about. It's written in German about families describing what their stories were that lived in Cologne pre-war. And I don't, it was in German, and Tal had shown me the book that was written actually by your predecessor in your current job. So I don't know how other people could get a hold of that publication.
You mean that book based on the eyewitness testimonies?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, I just put it in the chat, the title and the
okay,
and the details. So yeah, thank you for referring to the chat. I would now like to open the panel for questions from the audience. So if there's anything you'd like to know, you'd like to ask.
I just wanted to say that, Connie mentioned that the story is unknown, but as I wrote in the chat, it's front and center in Yad Vashem. There is a whole section with a film that has vivid pictures of Zbaszyn, and it's part of the guiding on every tour that takes place in Yad Vashem.
Okay, I'm just scrolling through the chat to see if there are any other questions, which I can't see. Okay, so if there are no more questions, once again, a big thank you to all three of you. It was incredibly interesting, and thanks for giving these personal insights into your families, into your own history, and yeah, well, thanks everyone else for attending, for coming, for asking, contributing with questions, and yeah, as I said, it's troubling times, and we all hope for more peaceful times to come again soon. And all the best to you, and well, have a nice evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Nice to meet you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.